Dark Knight is in a weird place right now. Despite being the highest damage tank again, it's the least played tank in all content by far. And now that week one of the first Savage tier is over, I've had a lot of time to play the job both on launch and for the entirety of the Savage tier, both as main tank and off tank. So I think I have a pretty good perspective on how the job currently feels to play, how it's performing, and generally just the state of the job now that Savage is over. There's been a lot of community sentiment, pretty overwhelmingly negative about Dark Knight since its update in Dawntrail. So I just want to talk about that, the things that I think that they got right with the changes, the good things that they did, and then address a lot of the negative things that happened to Dark Knight. So I mainly want to talk about the positives first, because I do think there are some good things that the job got. I think most of it centers around this button. So Disesteem, it doesn't seem like anything crazy. It's just a new GCD that hits really hard, whoop-de-doo. But what makes it so cool to me is because it has a 10-yard range, right? So this extended range, especially with the first Savage tier being as downtime heavy as it is, and when I say downtime I mean melee downtime, there's so many mechanics that you could find cool uses for this ability, and I think it's super fun in that respect. So just some examples off the top of my head, in M4S, when you have to do the lightning towers with the swords, there's a pattern where you have to be sent to out of melee range. The fourth sword is always out of melee range, and if you hold on to that 30-second scorn buff for Disesteem, you can, if it's second or third in line to go to the fourth sword, you can just move down there, and normally where you'd be sending it on mend, you just rip a steam, and it's still in buffs for the most part. So that's really cool to me. But that's pretty much where the positives end for the things that we got, because the plunge being removed from damage, this is a bit of a mixed bag with people. At least for me, I didn't really care that we were losing the damage on it. It's just more so that it wasn't replaced, right? So yeah, damage on gap closes is kind of dumb for the most part, but if you're gonna take it away, you gotta give us something back. Our 1 minute is just a fucking desolate wasteland. There is just nothing happening in our 1 minute burst now. You hit Delirium, you hit Carve and Spit, and you're done. You have your two edges, but you can't even use them quickly in succession. You have to space them out to make sure you have enough dark side. Like, it's just, you're just doing nothing but 1, 2, 3 for so long on Dark Knight now. And sure, like, Endwalker wasn't any better. It was definitely still a shit 1 minute burst window back then, but they somehow made it worse. So it's definitely rough in that regard. So again, I'm talking about the positives here. Disesteem, super fucking cool button, ranged utility that they didn't have before and no other tank really has, aside from maybe Paladin. I think it's just a super cool button. The Delirium combo itself looks super cool, satisfying to press. And I guess if you like the fact that plunge doesn't deal damage anymore, you don't have to save those charges for burst windows anymore. You can just use it how you want to. Then I suppose that's a positive for you as well. The negatives is unfortunately a much longer list. First and foremost, the biggest elephant in the room that everyone is always complaining about, and myself included, is the blood weapon and delirium change. So they combine those two buttons, which on its own isn't really a huge deal. Like, we lose the one weave, which is probably fine. But the problem is they didn't just stop there, right? So rather than just combine the two buttons, leave it at 5 blood weapon stacks, 3 delirium stacks, they reduce the blood weapon stacks on top of that, just so it's an easy, you hit delirium, you do 3 hits, and that's all you get. That essentially puts us down 1200 mana every minute, and not only does that have the effect of making our opener less busy, which I think was their intention, it also makes our subsequent 1 minutes less busy as well. So because we have less mana, we're losing an edge every single 1 minute burst. And to make matters even worse, on top of that, that means that we have less mana to use TBNs defensively. There's just not a ton of room to be able to TBN a teammate and not lose something from your burst. So like if it's your pop burst, because again, it doesn't, again, if you're playing selfishly, none of this really matters. But if it's like, say, your pop burst and you want to save as much mana as humanly possible for that pop burst, it really limits your time frame for when you can actually TBN someone defensively. So if something goes wrong and you need to save somebody's life, like, you have to choose now. Where I feel like in most cases in Endwalker, you didn't really have to choose. You can TBN pretty freely in Endwalker, and you can still have enough time to set up your TBN stack later. Because you have that much mana, you don't have to worry so much about Darkside. That's just free, right? Whereas now, you're pretty tight on what you can do. You have your edge that you have to spend during your 1 minute burst or you'll lose Darkside, and then you have another edge that you have to spend to not lose Darkside for your 2 minute. And outside of that, you have one slot of TBN open, and it really is just going to depend on how much mana you have at the time. Because if it's right after a 2 minute burst, you're probably not going to have your TBN back in time to help something. If something goes wrong immediately after that 2 minute window, the mana generation is just so much slower because of that loss of 2 blood weapon stacks that you may not have a TBN when you otherwise would. And I think that's probably the biggest drawback that I feel from this change. It's that I like Oblation. I like TBN. I like the fact that I have so much single target mitt to save people, because it feels awesome to be able to save a player that was otherwise dead. Just with a little bit of extra mitt, they survive, right? That's something that they took away from, right? That got weaker for Dark Knight, and for a job that has universally almost agreed upon the weakest spammable tank cooldown. That's just egregious, right? Like, why are we not only the one that gets punished if you don't use your TBN correctly, we're also the one that can use it less frequently now. It's been made worse on top of that. At a bare minimum, they shouldn't take away how frequently we can use it, right? That's the strength of TBN, the perceived strength, is because it has such a short cooldown. That's why it has to be weaker than the other tank cooldown. So if you give it such a short cooldown but no mana to use it, right, like, it doesn't really make any sense. So I think that's just universally agreed upon, that the blood weapon change to being only 3 stacks is the major cause for concern for the job. It detracts from the 1 minute, the 2 minute, the general play feel of being able to help people during raid with TBN defensively. It just detracts from every part of the job. And I think that's the biggest thing that the devs need to pay attention to, is that it just makes the job feel less fun. Like, I know they didn't want it to be a busy burst window, but like, why are you playing Dark Knight then, right? Like, if you didn't want to spam fucking every button on your keyboard, why are you playing Dark Knight? It just doesn't really make any sense to me. I understand maybe an accessibility standpoint, having to do fucking 15 OGCD weaves in an opener, probably not ideal. So that I think they did a good job with choosing Plunge as the one to go, right? But leaving that empty void of both the edges that we lost and the plunges that we lost, it just... I mean, they said it right. Like, it just feels like it lost its soul, almost, right? Like, it just feels like something's missing. So I guess one thing I didn't really talk about too much is the fact that Living Shadow doesn't cost blood anymore. I do think that means essentially your blood gauge is mostly irrelevant now. Sure, you can always pool a bunch of blood right before a burst window. That's obviously always going to be good, but that's about it. You'd never need 50 blood going into a 2 minute. If, like, before, if you were caught without 50 blood and your Living Shadows off cooldown, you're fucked. Like, that's probably the most damning thing you could do on Dark Knight back in Endwalker, and now that's just not a thing at all. So I guess they didn't want that to be the case, and I think Pre-Pulse Shadow can have some cool uses, so whatever. I think they definitely need to do something to compensate for the things that they took away, and it's a shame that they're waiting until probably 8.0, until they're probably gonna have to do a whole full-fledged rework now, because they kind of put themselves in this hole where they took away so much to make the burst window easier, and now they're just gonna fucking redo it all over again. I mean, look at Dragoon. Dragoon just got reworked, and it has more OGCD weaves than Dark Knight did in Endwalker, right? Like, they want jobs to not have busy burst windows, but they just designed a rework with that. So it seems like there's some kind of, like, miscommunication on what direction they want jobs to go in general. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see how, if they do end up going the rework route, on what that looks like. But for now, I'll just talk about what we have. Alright, so that pretty much covers everything about Dark Knight offensively at level 100. I think a lot of the problem, again, does come from the mana. But there's a lot of discussion as well about the survivability of Dark and how it's not really, they don't get any kind of justification for being as bad as they are. While I think that there should be some kind of trade-off for being the top damage tank, I don't know if this is the best way to go about it, right? Because at some point, there's gonna be a balance patch where Dark Knight is not the best, right? And we just experienced that. So in the launch of 7.0, Dark Knight was either the worst tank or the second worst tank in terms of ADPS. So when you look at that job with the self-sustain and defensive kit that it has, while also being one of the worst damage that you can bring to the raid, it really magnifies the problem that everybody's talking about, where why does this job suck so much at being alive, right? Sure, Shadowed Vigil, thank fucking god for that button. It's so fucking, it's just a breath of fresh air to be able to push a defensive button and fucking heal myself. Like that's what I do, right? Like Living Dead was kind of that in dungeon pulls, where you hit it, you'll be at 1 HP, assuming they let you fucking die first and foremost, and then you fully heal yourself, right? But that's a 5-minute cooldown. Now, we've also gotten a very long cooldown on Shadowed Vigil, but it's something, right? Like just that 1200 XCOG that they put on there just feels amazing to use on Dark Knight, because they've never had anything like that, right? So I do think there's more that they can do. I think Abyssal Drain is just this weird button now. Like it just put the heal on Carve and Spit, man. Just do something so that Abyssal Drain and Carve aren't this weird shared cooldown thing. Like I remember back in Shadowbringers when they were both used in the opener, it was just an extra weave, and that wasn't really great sustain either. But I feel like there's so many ways they can go with this. They could make Salted Earth heal you, because it does that in PvP. They could make TBN give you a regen if it breaks. Give Oblation a regen, but then it's kind of like Aurora but better, so I don't know about that. Like they have a lot of options on how they could make Dark Knight self-sustain better. But at the same time, it's not a huge concern of mine, or it's not huge on my list of concerns. A lot of people seem to think this is a huge problem that Dark Knight has. Again, it's never really something I've cared for. Even like with this raid tier being mostly physical damage, so both Dark Missionary, our defensive raid mitt, and Dark Mind were kind of useless most of this tier. It doesn't bother me, right? Like the only time that's gonna bother me is if they tune a fight to where I can't solve it, right? They make, physical wave cannon and top where Dark Mind doesn't help me at all. Like that's when I'll start to be upset, right? Because they tune the fight in a way that makes it like significantly harder for Dark Knight, where I don't think they've ever really done that before. Savage is never so deadly to the point where not having a Dark Mind-esque cooldown will matter. And when Dark Knight is good, it's amazing, right? So I'm cool with that. It's never really bothered me. I used to think Dark Mind was really bad when I first started playing Dark Knight, but every time it's useful, it is the best cooldown in the game. So I can't really complain about it. Living Dead as a defensive, man, they were so close. If this was just like 1600 heal potency, you would never have a chance of death. But as it stands right now, if you're 2.5 GCD and you happen to die on a late, like right after you hit a GCD, there is a chance you can still just naturally die to the timer of Living Dead. That is just a thing that can happen, and that is still kind of shit. But for the most part, it's very rare that happens. Some people have brought up that TBN should be a 25-second cooldown, give it a fucking XCOG, just basically make a Corundum 2. Again, I don't think it would matter all that much. I do like the fact that TBN has a short cooldown, but it's not the end of the world. As long as I have those 2 Oblation stacks, I'll feel like I have a lot of single target mitt to be able to spend pretty frequently. But I do think it is pretty underrated how often I'm able to use TBN to save somebody's life, number one, and then still have it for my buster that's coming up in, 10, 15 seconds later, right? Like, I think that's pretty understated on how often that happens, whether or not that matters. Like, was I going to die to the buster if I didn't have the TBN? Probably not, but it's pretty cool in that respect, I guess. I'm pretty biased on TBN, I can admit that, but it would just be a shame, I think, if it was just Corundum too. I think if they could find something unique for it and make it 25 seconds, I don't think I would have a problem with it at all. I don't think Dark Knight is as dramatic as people make it out to be. With how much single target mitt healers have and how much mitt tanks have, you have to really fuck up to not be able to do dungeons on Dark Knight. I mean, maybe I'm an asshole for saying that, but I don't think it's that hard. Yeah, get good, I guess. Alright, the part of the video nobody cares about except for me, and that's lower level Dark Knight. So, not something that super matters in the grand scheme of things. I know most people probably don't give a shit, but it is something that I like to bring up because at this point, it's pretty fucking egregious. When I talk about low level, I of course am only really talking about, level 70 ultimates, T for level 80, DSR on top for level 90 now. I think they're just fun to do. So I think it is important that on some level, the jobs function at those levels, right? So many people complain about how when you're leveling on a job, you just have, like Reaper, for example, you just have fucking nothing in level 70 content. I don't think that's a good design choice, right? I don't think Reaper should just have their 1, 2, 3 and nothing else that teaches you how to play Reaper or is enjoyable to play like Reaper, right? So with that in mind, let's talk about fucking level 70 Dark Knight. Where do I start? Even from the launch of Endwalker, Dark Knight has just been, without a doubt, the worst tank to bring into level 70 ultimates for, what has it got to be, like 3 years now? They bring the worst damage, and then the biggest elephant in the room, my fucking most hated part of level 70 Dark Knight is that it does not have fucking Dark Missionary at level 70. So I've realized that this was released in Shadowbringers, and that's why it was a higher level. But there are so many examples of jobs getting a new utility or like something that's meant to be a core part of their kit, and they just slot it in at an earlier level. Great example of Dawntrail. White Mage just got an Onavant-esque dash. That's at level 40, right? Why can't Dark Missionary just be level 60 something? Like, there's no reason for them to have released it at level 76. I mean, I guess they just didn't have anything else to slot at that level, so that's why they did it. But it just feels so bad to like be in Primal Roulette or Golden Bahamut and just not able to contribute to the stacks really at all comparatively to the other tanks, right? Like, you have your rep, but again, every tank has that rep. You have Tank LB, but every tank has Tank LB. The only thing I don't have is a really powerful mitt that could help with those big raid wides, right? So like Primal Roulette and Nuwu, you have the party stacks, right, that happen after you do the dodge, and the raid wide. I can cover both of those things and make the heal check for that way less significant, right? So that's something I could be contributing to the group and make it more likely that we're going to clear in PF when people are not as consistent and not as perfect at making sure everything's there. Being down a mitt is awful. It's just such a recipe for disaster. I fucking tank LB Primal Roulette probably more often than I don't these days, just to make sure if like somebody dies that they don't focus too hard on rezzing, and then we don't get the shields and topped up fully like we need to. So it just feels bad, right? Like this needs to be below level 70, and I don't think anybody really disagrees with that. It's just so weird that it's the only tank that doesn't have that. And going back to the damage of Dark Knight at level 70, Dark Knight just got a 1-2-3 combo buff, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't apply retroactively. So they took away mana from Dark Knight at all levels, so they're weaker because they don't have Living Shadow to compensate for it. You lost 1200 mana every minute. We were already the weakest damage. We're even worse now. We don't have a party utility raid mitt, and we also lost damage from Plunge. So like, we're down horrendous at level 70, right? It's not good. And then they buff the 1-2-3 combo, which is something that Dark Knight really needs at all levels, but it only applies to level 94, right? The level 94 trait. So it also isn't helping them in the 90 ultimates either. So it's just fucking depressing for level 70 Dark Knight, I'll be honest. It's something that I really enjoy doing. I really enjoy doing Yukabanuwu, but like, oof, it's fucking rough now. It's like I genuinely feel bad playing Dark Knight in those parties. That's something they definitely need to pay some kind of attention to. Maybe the job rework that they do in 8.0 can address that, because then they're gonna have to look at everything when they do that. But ultimately, the damage of Dark Knight in those ultimates doesn't fucking matter. We kill the bosses too fast anyway. They need fucking Dark Missionary. They need to have that mitt. It just feels like griefing to bring Dark Knight without it. So please, if somehow a dev sees this, level 70 Dark Missionary. And I think that pretty much wraps up everything that I feel about Dark Knight, but I haven't really, like, I've kind of stated everything factually, but never really how I feel about it. I'm pretty biased, I guess I could say. I have roughly 5,000 hours on this job. I don't think I'm going to be playing anything else seriously, or as seriously as I do with Dark Knight. I don't think it's in such a bad place that I would want to play the other tanks, really. Like, while I think Gunbreaker, Paladin, and Warrior all look and play really well right now, I do think that the job feels kind of like Endwalker, I'll be honest. Like, I liked Endwalker Dark Knight. Dawntrail's pretty much identical, with a cool new range GCD, so I'm kind of vibing with it. I do think there are causes for concern, though, right? Like, that, just give us our fucking mana back. Give us our mana back, I think we'll be fine. I don't know. I think the 1 minute is what really needs the attention. The 2 minutes mostly fine. They just need to make the 1 minute more interesting in some regard. It's just so fucking decrepit. But I know a lot of people didn't feel the same way, right? So there's a lot of Dark Knight mains that I know who moved on to other tanks this tier. So if that's you, let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious as to what it was that made you switch. What was the change that they made that really was your breaking point, I guess. And if you like this kind of video, maybe I'll make another one after the Ultimate comes out. I imagine by then there'll be some kind of more drastic changes to Dark Knight, but who knows? Maybe this will be the version of Dark Knight we're playing for another 3 years, so we'll see how it goes.